evening, nearly 100 years ago, students, faculty, Baptists, politicians, and friends of Acadia gathered in Assembly Hall a few dozen yards from here to celebrate the college's Golden Jubilee. Nearly 2,000 people crowded the building that evening in what the Halifax Herald called the grandest gathering that ever took place west of Halifax. The paper enthused, the wealth and brains, the youth and beauty, and the strength and manhood of the denomination were assembled. The building was suitably decorated with plants and flowers, spruce boughs, and Chinese lanterns. And mounted high on the wall was the biblical text, "Hitherto the Lord hath helped us." Having seen the sights and been suitably impressed by the decorations, the assembled guests settled down for an exciting program of music and speeches. That evening and the following day, speaker after speaker rose to extol the virtues of Acadia College and praise all that had been accomplished in the past 50 years. But there was also a serious attempt on the part of those present to understand how it had all come about. How could one explain the survival and growth of the college when everything would seem to have mitigated against it? As to the underlying cause for the success of the institution, there was no doubt in the minds of those present. It was heralded by the motto on the wall and reiterated by nearly every speaker on the program. For the Jubilee sermon, Edward Manning Saunders took as his text 1 Corinthians 3:9, "For we are laborers together with God." The founding and development of Acadia College had been in accordance with the purposes of God Himself, and only in this way could Maritime Baptists explain its remarkable success in the face of such opposition and hardship. Saunders argued, quote, "The bright and dark features, the prosperity and the adversity, all alike contribute to the evidence that the beginning and work of Acadia College have been according to the good pleasure of Him under whose superintendence and by whose help the institutions have continued till this day." Unquote. This not only explained the past, but also gave purpose to the future. Given the importance of the times in which we live, Saunders asked rhetorically, should we now close Acadia? To which he not surprisingly replied, "Nay, verily, but let the holy purpose take, if possible, a deeper and firmer hold of the Baptist heart, to make Acadia College fill to the full God's purpose, to the joy of the living, the unborn, and those who, having finished their course, are now in the presence of God." Having acknowledged God as author and director of this accomplishment, the speakers went on to probe further in their efforts to understand the college which they so obviously loved and respected. If God was the author, what was the agency by which all of this had been accomplished? The writer of the memorial address perceptively put his finger on the beginning of an important understanding of Acadia College in the 19th century, without perhaps realizing the significance of what he was saying. He wrote, "Standing in 1828, we see two marvelous trains of events in progress, the one arising away back in the latter half of the last century and gathering elements of strength in ever-increasing ration. The other dating visibly only a few years previous to 1828, both nearing each other and at length culminating in that year in the founding of a seminary of learning at Wolfville, which was shortly to grow into Acadia College. It was, he argued, the power unleashed by the Great Awakening and its charismatic preacher Henry Allen, united with the intellectual leadership brought into the denomination by the rupture in St. Paul's Anglican Church in Halifax in the mid-1820s, that had produced the marvelous results. God, with His human agents, thus stood at the center of their understanding of the Acadia College of their time." In spite of the simplicity of expression, the writer did have grasp of a fundamental concept in comprehending the nature of the institution we are concerned with tonight. Acadia College was the result of the coming together of not just two divergent streams, however, but of many. And any understanding of the institution in the 19th century must begin with an acceptance of this remarkable diversity which characterized not only its founding, but also its subsequent development. It was this diversity that molded and shaped the college, that accounted for its survival, and the overwhelming success it was celebrated so joyfully and thankfully almost 100 years ago. And it was that diversity of origin that it gave Acadia the breadth of vision and mind that so characterized the institution in the 19th century. When one examines the founding of Canada's universities in the first half of the last century, it is quickly apparent that, for most of them, the driving force, the leadership, and the ideas came from a small but significant element. Such leadership was usually British-born, steeped in the traditions of its particular religious heritage, drawn from the upper or upper middle classes, and with considerable exposure to and familiarity with the educational philosophy of its time and place. The educational leaders of the Anglican or Presbyterian or Roman Catholic churches struck out decisively and precisely to found institutions which reflected their views and fulfilled their needs. Such colleges as McGill in Montreal, King's in Windsor, or Queen's in Kingston were also the product of years of debate and careful planning to assure that the institution thus built would be an accurate reflection of the views of the elite, social or religious, that undertook that building. There certainly was not always unanimity among such builders. In fact, there seldom was. However, the differences, the disagreements, the quarrels over philosophy or program usually took place within carefully defined limits, the limits imposed by the thinking of that religious or social elite. However, the dissenting tradition in Canada has a very different development, leading in very different directions. Acadia University is the product of that dissenting tradition, and nothing marks the early development of this institution as clearly or as forcefully as does the diversity and the complexity of that tradition. Acadia is founded by the Baptists of Nova Scotia and developed by the Baptists of the Maritime Provinces. In the 19th century, an amorphous, divergent, and often acrimonious body that almost defies definition. Within the bounds of that denomination, one could find almost every conceivable tradition, philosophy, belief, and aspiration, existing in often uneasy relationship one with another. My study of the Baptist denomination in the 19th century and of Acadia University would lead me to conclude that the Baptists, as a body, were a most undogmatic people. That many individual Baptists held very strong and well-developed ideas is not to be doubted for a moment. But to argue from that these were understood or accepted by the majority of their fellow Baptists cannot, I think, be maintained. In the 19th century, the Baptist denomination is just being formed in the maritime colonies, and beyond a few fundamentals, there was little unity or agreement. Many key questions had not yet even been asked, let alone answered, by the denomination as a whole. Whatever changes might be taking place in the denomination by the end of the last century, or in the early decades of this century, however dogmatic the denomination might later become, it must be remembered that Acadia University was not founded, as was McMaster in the 1880s, or in the early 20th century, but in 1838, when the denomination, and therefore its creation, the college, were dominated by very different and very divergent ideas. And it is perhaps this which has so perplexed and at times infuriated some maritime Baptists about their university in this century. Some understanding of the diversity of the denomination and of the college itself can perhaps be gained by a quick look at the men who occupied the stage at Acadia's first graduating exercises, the annual anniversary services, as they were called. The date was June 16, 1843, and it was an especially proud day for many Nova Scotia Baptists, for the first fruits of their academic labors were now to be reaped. The platform party that day was composed of the Honourable Charles Ramage Prescott, Thomas Andrew Strange de Wolfe, the Attorney General, the Honourable J.W. Johnston, Simon Fitch, Charles Harris, and Caleb Bill, all governors of the college. the Reverend Edmund A. Crawley, the Reverend John Pryor, and Isaac Chipman, professors, and the Reverends Theodore Seth Harding and Edward Manning. In terms of age, education, background, views, and philosophies, one could hardly have assembled a more dissimilar group, and yet there they were, applauding the 4 young men who that day comprised Acadia's first graduating class. Prescott from nearby Stars Point and DeWolf from Wolfville itself were both Nova Scotia government appointees to the Board of Governors. Prescott was a well-known orchardist and former member of the Legislative Council. DeWolf was a prominent merchant, member of the Legislative Assembly for Kings County, and member of the Executive Council. Both were Anglicans. Simon Fitch, Charles Harris, and Caleb Bill were Baptists of New England planter descent. Bill was the brother of the Reverend I.E. Bill, who played a prominent part in the founding of Acadia and was one of its strongest supporters. Caleb Bill would later serve as MLA for Kings County, and after Confederation was one of Nova Scotia's representatives in the House of Senate. Fitch would serve Acadia long and loyally, both on the board and as a fundraiser. The Honorable J.W. Johnston, the Attorney General of the colony, was of far greater significance to Acadia than the other 5 men combined. Born in Jamaica of Loyalist parents, Johnston was trained in the law and quickly became a prominent lawyer in Halifax and a leading member of St. Paul's Anglican Church in that city. In the mid-1820s, a major quarrel with Bishop John Inglis led to the embittered departure from the Anglican Church of Johnston and a number of other dissidents. After considerable hesitation and uncertainty, Johnston became a member of Granville Street Baptist Church in Halifax and would play a leading role in the denomination for the rest of his life. His own involvement in politics, and in particular his antipathy to Joseph Howe, would eventually drag the Baptists into the worst political quarrel in which they ever involved themselves. However, Johnston's political position had served the Baptists well in their search for support for Acadia's charter and for provincial funding. Johnston had been one of the driving forces behind the founding of the institution and was one of her stalwart supporters, provided, of course, that things went as Johnston wanted. Johnston, moderate Tory, former Anglican, Haligonian, could sit on that platform with confidence and pride, never perhaps realizing the gulf that still separated him from many of the Baptists in the audience. The 3 professors assembled there that day also represent a study in contrast. Edmund A. Crawley, John Pryor, and Isaac Chipman constituted the entire teaching staff of Acadia College in 1843, but even in such small numbers represented a wider range than was to be found at most of the other British North American universities at the time. Crawley and Pryor shared much in common and stood together on many issues. A native of England, Crawley was raised in Cape Breton, while Pryor was born and raised in Halifax. Of well-to-do, upper-class families, both were brought up in the Anglican Church and both attended King's College, Windsor, where they came under strong evangelical influences. Along with Johnston and others, both took part in the rupture in St. Paul's and were part of the move to the Baptist position that followed. Crawley had been one of the key men in the establishment of Horton Academy in 1828, and Pryor became its second principal in 1830. Both men studied theology in the United States, and both had become ordained Baptist ministers. They were also alike in that they continued to rely for their power in the denomination on the influential Halifax Baptist clique composed of former Anglicans. Pryor and Crawley would each in turn become president of the institution they helped to found, and around both would swirl storms of controversy for much of their lives. Much younger Isaac Chipman was very different from his colleagues. Born in the Annapolis Valley, only a few miles from Horton, the son of a proud planter family, Chipman had been raised in a pious Baptist home and sent to the newly established Horton Academy for his education. A brilliant student and devout Christian, young Chipman considered a career in the ministry before turning to education. He received his college education in the United States and returned to Nova Scotia shortly after the founding of Acadia College. He gave the rest of his life to university teaching at a time when it was usual in British North America for only ordained ministers to hold such positions. The survival and growth of Acadia in the 1840s and early 1850s was in no small measure due to Chipman's energy, foresight, and self-sacrifice. The two aged ministers who also occupied a proud place on the platform that memorable day were numbered among the fathers of the denomination. Both men were in their 70s, and each represented long years of service to the Baptist cause. Harding, who would so eloquently invoke God's blessing on the day's proceedings, had served for nearly 50 years as minister of the Horton Baptist Church. Of planter stock, with no formal education of which to boast, he had begun his ministry as a Methodist preacher, and on a number of occasions his commitment to the Baptist cause would temporarily weaken. Beside him sat the aged Edward Manning, pastor of the Cornwallis Baptist Church, and probably the most respected minister in the denomination. Yet he too showed signs of a non-Baptist beginning. Born in Ireland into a Roman Catholic family, Manning had been converted in Nova Scotia in the aftermath of the Great Awakening and had become a New Light Congregationalist, and then, by slow steps, a Baptist. Convinced of the necessity of formal education, he had aided materially in the movement to found Horton Academy in 1828 and Acadia College in 1838, and had served as the chairman of the Nova Scotia Baptist Education Society since its inception. And now he sat on the platform and presided over Acadia's first graduation exercises, a man with little formal schooling himself. Even a superficial glance at this diverse assemblage on the Acadia platform speaks volumes as to the origin of this institution. In terms of background, religious upbringing, educational attainments, and philosophies, it would be difficult to assemble a more disparate group at any college in Canada at that time. And when one looks below the surface, the range and the complexity of those who founded and directed Acadia become even more striking. In fact, aside from a few essentials, there appeared to be little unanimity, nor, in fact, was such unanimity expected. Unlike most colleges founded in Canada at this time, Acadia was not established to promote a specific ideology or dogma, for the Baptists of Nova Scotia did not collectively possess one. It was not built to conserve a way of life, but to be the vehicle by which that life could be changed. It existed not to safeguard a social position, but to advance it. Drawing on such a diverse background, Acadia would be broadly based and remarkably tolerant of dissenting views. And in this lay the real strength of the college in the 19th century. Those men sitting on that platform in 1843 represented not only the superficial differences alluded to, but were symbolic of far more significant streams that had come together to create the Baptist denomination and its child, Acadia College. It was Acadia's good fortune, I think, to have been founded at a time when there was still a healthy, invigorating tension between the forces of town and country, the educated and the uneducated, the upper class and the middling sort. The college that these different forces created was not a compromise, a via media, but rather an exciting combination of at times contradictory ideas and aspirations. Certainly such divergence is observable in the founding itself. Acadia was established to serve a number of ends, to accomplish a variety of purposes, to hew out more than one new path. It is often assumed that the chief purpose of the new institution was to produce more ministers to spread over the land, adding converts to the Baptist churches. The denomination, however, was too deeply divided over the issue of an educated clergy to accept this as the rationale for the new college's existence. For the rest of the century, and dare I suggest beyond, many maritime Baptists harbored considerable fear that education would smother piety, that the search for earthly wisdom would divert the pious young man from his search for the real meaning of life. For more than 60 years after Acadia's founding, theology would be taught only intermittently, largely because the Baptist churches of the Maritimes would not give sufficient money to support such a program. Part of this reluctance perhaps stems from the fact that collectively Maritime Baptists had not yet decided what their theology really was. No, if Baptists had waited until they were ready to found a theological institution, there would have been no new Baptist college in 1838, and perhaps not in that century. Nor could Baptists agree on whom a college should serve or by whom it should be controlled. A scant 2 months before he would lead the Baptists in the founding of Acadia College on November 15, 1838, Edmund Crawley still confidently opposed such a move, expecting a professorship at a newly reconstituted Dalhousie. For at least 3 of those men on the platform in 1843, Crawley, Pryor, and Johnston, there was clearly no fear of a state-controlled college located in the heart of downtown Halifax. And yet it was just such fears that had prevented many of the rural Baptists from supporting the attempts to open Dalhousie College at last. Fear of state-dominated education and distaste for all that city life stood for. And beyond that, there was a deep cleavage within the denomination concerning who should receive an education. Pervading many of the petitions, the letters to the editor, and the speeches of the next few years was the underlying conviction that education ought to be placed within the reach of everyone, by which they meant, of course, within the reach of every male. There was strong opposition to the idea of education for an elite only, whether that elite was a social or an intellectual one. Education for the common people and the ordinary intellect thus became an important underlying theme in Acadia's development, one that ought not to be overlooked in placing this institution in the broader context of 19th century Canadian higher education. Given the background from which they came and the positions they continue to occupy, it is not surprising to find that some of the Halifax Baptists would reveal a fair amount of ambivalence on this subject. If there was no unanimity as to who should be taught or under what direction, there was considerably less certainty as to what should be taught. In fact, there was remarkably little concern expressed over this matter during Acadia's first 50 years. One searches the newspaper, convention reports, and even the minutes of the Board of Governors almost in vain for a serious discussion as to what constitutes a proper education at a Baptist-controlled college. Occasionally one finds reference to the need of adding certain courses to the curriculum, such as modern languages or various branches of science, but almost invariably the ensuing discussion centered on the cost, not the appropriateness of the proposed addition. Even theological education seldom roused 19th century maritime Baptists to debate. Once again, it was usually the cost rather than the subject matter that provoked discussion. Usually less than 1/3 of the Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick Baptist churches sent in their expected donations to fund the chair of theology. Even the furious debate in the early 1880s over the establishment of the chair of didactics and education appears to have had much more to do with Baptist politics and personalities than pedagogical principles. The convention and maritime Baptists in general seemed content to leave matters of program, about which they knew little, in the hands of the president and faculty of the college. In the 20th century, they were no longer content always to do so, nor did they always reveal the same confidence in the college and its staff. None of this is to suggest that the 19th century Baptists who did concern themselves with higher education, by no means always the majority of the denomination, did not have a firm and generally accepted idea of what their college should accomplish. With the possible exception of the Halifax clique, and their views change so quickly and conveniently that it is often hard to pin them down, there seems to have been a basic unifying theme running through much of the discussion concerning higher education during this half-century. Certainly, it was expected that Acadia would be a Christian college, and that point is reiterated time after time in the years after its founding. It underlay the aversion to and rejection of Dalhousie College or any other government-controlled institution of higher learning. Their college and the education received there was to be God-centered. Of that there could be no doubt. However, their means of achieving this end was not to be found in control of the curriculum, but in the careful development of the very atmosphere of the institution. From the beginning, the founders and those who backed them rejected the idea of a narrow sectarian base for the college. Given the difficulty inherent in deciding what was uniquely and distinctly Baptist at this time, It is perhaps less surprising than it might be to see a broad Christian base being chosen. Hence that phrase in the original charter of which successive generations would be so proud. And be it further enacted that no religious tests or subscriptions shall be required of the professors, fellows, scholars, graduates, students, or officers of the said college, but that all the privileges and advantages thereof shall be open and free to all and every person and persons whomsoever, without regard to religious persuasion. At times since, too much has been read into that clause, and totally incorrect construction placed upon it. The rest of that paragraph and many other pronouncements of the 19th century make it abundantly clear that where religious was written, denominational was actually meant. The founders were certainly broad-minded for the time, but it would be quite wrong to believe that they contemplated for a moment the idea of a non-Christian teaching at Acadia. That would have defeated one of the main purposes in establishing the institution. The second half of the above clause, usually rather conveniently omitted in any discussion of this matter, makes the intention much clearer. It reads, "And it shall and may be lawful for the trustees and governors of the said college to select as professors and other teachers or officers competent persons of any religious persuasion whatever, provided such person or persons shall be of moral and religious character." A memorandum drawn up in early 1839 further clarifies the thinking of the founders on this important subject. It reads in part, quote, "Any competent person possessed of vital piety and good moral character shall be eligible to a professor's chair without regard to his religious denomination." Unquote. And here I think one is getting close to the heart of the concept of Christian education as understood and practiced by the founders and supporters of Acadia College in the 19th century. It was in the Christian character of the professors and the Christian character of the institution itself, not in the content of the courses or the selection of the curriculum, that these Baptists placed their reliance. And for the rest of the century, the ultimate success of Acadia College would be measured not in the Cicero memorized or the theorems learned, but in the souls won for Christ. The successive revivals that swept the campus were clear proof of God's seal of approval, that Acadia was, quote, "so evidently owned and blessed of God," unquote, as one writer phrased it. Writing many years later about the founding, John Pryor recorded that, quote, "Our Baptist friends had a strong prejudice against education, and they feared it would injure the young, teaching them philosophy and vain conceit. This prejudice wore off when it pleased the Lord to bless us with revival after revival, so that, as dear Father Manning used to say, the Academy, instead of being an ice house to freeze out religion, had become a very hotbed of piety." Unquote. In 1863, the president, J.M. Cramp, wrote to the Christian Messenger, "We greatly need the baptism of the Spirit here. In other respects, our prospects were never more favorable. But oh, that God would come in the might and majesty of his grace to call the dead to life." In 1874, that same newspaper carried an article entitled "The Presence of Christ at Acadia," which showed how deeply entrenched the Acadia revivalist tradition had become. Quote, "The present senior class had considerable apprehension lest they should leave the college without seeing the work of God revived. They, with the other students of both departments, prayed and wrestled and worked, and the Lord at last made bare his arm to save." Unquote. 30 students were converted in the ensuing revival. The feelings of many Baptists were well summed up in the letter to the editor of one writer commenting on the meaning of this revival. "If any doubt existed as to the propriety of keeping up a separate denominational college, surely that doubt will now give way to faith. In what other way could this priceless blessing to our sons and daughters have been secured? They have received the best of all educational attainments, for the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. In what university of a general and mixed nature would our children have reaped these religious beliefs? Where do we ever read of religious revival at a national or provincial university? It is one of the most striking facts in connection with the history of Acadia College that not once or twice, but many times powerful and far-reaching manifestations of divine grace have been experienced within her walls. What one profoundly experienced then in the core of one's being, not what one learned rationally in the classroom, was the essence of the Acadia idea of a Christian education. It was the providing of the necessary Christian atmosphere and Christian leadership, not the selection of a carefully regulated curriculum, that was perceived to be the main responsibility of the governors and professors of Acadia. And acting upon that belief gave the college very important freedom in course selection and program planning in the 19th century. If Maritime Baptists of the last century were deeply divided over many aspects of higher education, there was nonetheless widespread agreement in their assessment of the times in which they lived. The feeling that they lived in an age of progress, a time of general advancement, seems to have pervaded their society. Everywhere they looked in the middle decades of that century, they saw, quote, the progressive march of human history, unquote, as one speaker entitled his lecture to the Acadia Athenaeum. What was very clear was that if they did not go forward, both as individuals and as a denomination, they would go backward, and that they were not prepared to do. Not only were there general and observable upward movements in their society, but clearly the Baptist cause in the maritime colonies in the first half of the century was also on the rise. From very small beginnings, it had mushroomed into one of the most dynamic of the maritime denominations. It had spread throughout the countryside in all three colonies, leading to the founding of dozens of new churches in that period. Moreover, several of the leaders saw something very significant in the dramatic inroads made in the 1820s into the upper classes of Halifax and St. John. Surely clear proof of God's work on the march. The growing conviction that education held the key to advancement proved a powerful stimulus to the establishment of Horton Academy and then Acadia College, and it certainly provided the glue which bound disparate elements within the denomination together in their support of the institutions. The opposition to the granting of Acadia's charter, Joseph Howe's attack on the college in the 1840s, and the problems over provincial support were all seen by many Baptists as part of a plot to deprive them of the means of advancement, to keep them in subservient positions forever. Writing to the newspaper in 1843, one female correspondent noted, "Our enemies in Nova Scotia have ever derided the Baptists for their want of learning, and now they are trying to cut off the only means through which they can obtain it. I have many years longed to see the day when grace, good sense, native talent, and learning should be united and more generally enjoyed by the Baptists in Nova Scotia. And at the age of 66, I have seen that day begin to dawn." An editorial, a decade and a half later, in recommending Horton Academy to its readers, observed, "The demand for education by all classes cannot fail to make this and other similar institutions more and more highly valued as we proceed in the onward march of improvement. A larger amount of educational training is required now to enable a young man to maintain his position than formerly, and unless his early years are improved by the diligent use of all his opportunities, he will soon find himself left behind by those perhaps with fewer advantages, but who have been early trained to habits of industry. Those able to give their sons such a course of training would benefit them more by an expenditure of £5 in this way than by neglecting their education and leaving them in possession of hundreds or thousands." Colleges were, it was maintained later, quote, "the very fountains of civilization and safeguards from a return to primitive ignorance," unquote. Of course, there were many Baptists who feared, not admired, education and institutions of higher learning. But among those who did support education, whether upper-class former Anglicans from Halifax or rural Baptist farmers from Annapolis County or the St. John River Valley, there seemed to be general agreement that an institution of higher learning under Baptist sponsorship offered them the best means by which the general advancement of the denomination and of their sons and grandsons could be secured. As the Baptist press editorialized in 1841, it will soon be apparent, quote, "whether the Baptists as a denomination are hereafter to appeal to others than those of their own body to advocate their claims before the public, in the halls of our legislature, in our courts of justice, and in conducting the operations of the press. In truth, whether in all the leading and important matters that regard the welfare of society, they are to become the hewers of wood and drawers of water to those who shall have assumed a merited superiority over them. Unquote. It was the utilitarian aspects of education, then, that attracted these people, and they would demand of Acadia a useful, practical course of training for the aspiring generations to come. The search for useful education to aid in their general advancement would see the exploration of many new fields by Acadia's directors over the first 60 years. The type and quality of the men that Acadia would attract as professors and presidents during that period is the final factor that should be looked at in assessing the origins of Acadia's approach to education. In looking at the four men who presided over Acadia until near the end of the century, one thing becomes abundantly clear. Although each was a strong, forceful individual with well-developed ideas and concepts of his own, none was able to so completely dominate the institution as to totally alter its direction. For better or worse, Acadia during this period has no J.W. Dawson of McGill or G.M. Grant of Queens, no one in whose life and thoughts can be seen the essence of the college. During the first crucial years, there was no president at all, with the college totally in the hands of the faculty. It has been done, Dr. Perkins. John Pryor's presidency was brief and unimaginative, and the later scandals which rocked his ministry destroyed his influence both at Acadia and within the denomination. John Moffat Cramp was very different from Pryor, the former Anglican and Haligonian. English-born and trained in the dissenting college tradition of England, Cramp brought to Acadia yet another set of educational ideas. He was also an outstanding scholar and served Acadia for nearly 3 decades. He clearly had the intellect and the rigorous commitment to have imposed his ideas, his philosophies, on the still malleable institution. However, Cramp did not possess the necessary desire to so control the college, nor did he get the opportunity. The determination of the Halifax clique to once again seize control of Acadia in the early 1850s, and their manipulation of the situation and of Cramp resulted in the latter being rather ruthlessly and temporarily shouldered aside and replaced by the more aggressive Edmund Crawley. Certainly in Crawley, Acadia had a president with sufficient determination and willpower to play the part of a Dawson or Grant. 2 things only did he lack. One was sufficient time to carry out any such plan. The other was the necessary intellect for the job. If one is looking in Acadia's history for evidence of providential intervention, surely one might begin by a glance at the chain of events which led to the departure of Edmund Crawley and a third of Acadia's endowment fund in the mid-1850s. For although he would prove remarkably durable and continue to exert considerable influence over Acadia's development, it was, I think thankfully, never the all-pervading control that he had striven to achieve. Acadia's 4th president, A.W. Sawyer, brought yet another major influence to the campus, or rather reinforced one already present. Sawyer was American-born, American-trained, and unlike all of his predecessors, had considerable experience in college teaching and administration before coming to Acadia as president. Serving the college from 1869 to 1896, Sawyer certainly had ample time to mold and shape, and this he did to a considerable degree. Acadia was greatly influenced by Sawyer's long regime, but he never attempted to so control or alter the institution's character as to remake it in his own image. Perhaps after 30 years of rather rugged survival, it was already too late for one personality to totally alter Acadia's course. Taking the 4 presidents together, it is clear that Acadia during this time was the beneficiary of remarkably wide-ranging views and talents. Few universities in Canada in the 19th century proved themselves as prepared to borrow so heavily or willingly on such a combination of native, American, and English talent and tradition. Much the same flexibility and breadth is observable when one looks at the faculty employed during this period. The basis of the Acadia approach to faculty was revealed in the clause of the charter quoted above. Unlike so many other institutions of higher education in Canada, an exclusivist hiring policy was never pursued at Acadia. An examination of the religious affiliation of professors and teachers at the college and academy make it very clear that more than lip service was being paid to the declaration of religious freedom. A man's broader moral and religious convictions were more important to his prospective employer than any narrow denominational label. Thus, for example, in the late 1850s, Acadia could have the stimulating experience of having on campus as her first professor of French and German one Gustave Peple, a Belgian educated by the Moravians in Europe. Rather than drawing narrowly on only one aspect of the Christian church, as it was still quite common to do in higher education circles in Canada, Acadia was prepared to cast a wider net. Even with its refusal to move outside the boundaries of evangelical Christianity, Acadia still possessed a broader faculty base than many of her sister institutions. One other attitude toward faculty, or rather potential faculty, ought to be mentioned. Lacking slavish attachments to religious bodies or educational institutions in either the mother country or the United States, and with very real pride in their college, the Baptist denomination and the Board of Governors of Acadia expressed no reservations about hiring Acadia's own sons. In this, Acadia was one of the first truly Canadian colleges, unafraid and unashamed of native British North Americans at a time when so many felt that unless one possessed an Oxford, Cambridge, or Edinburgh degree, or at the very least one from Harvard or Yale, then one was not truly educated. Acadia's first two faculty members, Pryor and Crawley, both had their degrees from a Nova Scotia college, King's in Windsor. The third professor, added in 1840, was Isaac Chipman, a native of the Annapolis Valley, a graduate of Horton Academy, and a college in the United States. The sacrifices that Chipman made for the institution, the burdens that he carried, and the brilliance of his mind and the piety of his life would thereafter make it impossible for aspersions to be cast on anyone merely because he was native-born or educated in Wolfville. A healthy respect was certainly maintained for the great universities of the age, and many a young Acadia graduate was sent off for further study at an Edinburgh or a Harvard. But a healthy respect was accorded their own institution as well. No sign of a colonial mentality is observable here. By 1863, the Baptist press could enthuse, "It is a very gratifying circumstance that Acadia College will not henceforth be dependent on other countries for professors. Her chairs will be filled by her own sons. The lists of graduates contains the names of gentlemen who are well qualified to take any position which their alma mater may assign them." Acadia by no means hired solely her own in the 19th century, but she was clearly unafraid of seeing a native-born, native-trained faculty at a Canadian university. Acadia's comparatively liberal hiring practices brought to the campus men of diverse background, training, and ideas, certainly adding to the complexity and strength of the institution. It could be argued, I think, that even the willingness to hire her native sons added substantially to the breadth of the institution. Most of these Acadia graduates studied at other institutions before returning to their alma mater to teach, bringing with them, of course, a range of views and experiences. Does the fact that these men were not strangers, that they were familiar faces and trusted intellects, help explain the apparent ease with which such professors slipped into the life of the university and the denomination, with few questions asked about their views by either the governors or the denomination as a whole? Both A.B. McKillop and Ramsay Cook, in their books on critical inquiry and social criticism in Victorian Canada, have pointed out the extensive suspicion and even fear of German ideas in German universities that pervaded much of Canada in the latter half of the last century, and the tension that it caused in some Canadian universities. Yet, in 1878, Daniel Morse Welton, Acadia class of 1855, latterly pastor of the Baptist Church in Windsor, took a Ph.D. at the University of Leipzig, and then returned to his theology professorship at Acadia College. Far from fearing such new influences, Acadia gave Welton an honorary degree in 1884. Was Welton more acceptable, more trusted within the Acadia and Baptist community because he was one of their own, not a stranger arriving with new and perhaps dangerous ideas? Did new concepts and ways of thinking thus find an easier entry into the college system because of such familiarity with the man, if not the subject matter? Certainly Welton was not the only such graduate to return to his alma mater bearing strange gifts from abroad. As important as it is to examine who was hired and why, it is perhaps of equal significance to see who was not hired at Acadia in the 19th century. Within the bounds of Protestant Christianity, there was one notable element largely lacking from the Acadia faculty and the Acadia experience, and this absence does much to distinguish this college from most other 19th century English Canadian institutions. McKillop has written that in the last century, quote, Canadian education was shaped by men who were trained at Scottish universities, unquote. Almost everywhere one looks in English Canada, one sees the validity of such a statement. Almost everywhere, but not at Acadia. Having few faculty members and no administrators trained at the great Scottish universities, Acadia can in no sense be seen as a child of this great educational tradition. Certainly, Acadia was considerably influenced by the Scottish philosophy, particularly as it came to Wolfville via American colleges, but she was never dominated by it. In this way, Acadia, more than many of her sister institutions at the time, was free to take what was useful from such a tradition, without having the college pervaded by it. This freedom, potentially at least, made Acadia more open to new and conflicting ideas and philosophies, in a place where serious intellectual inquiry might take place. It was then a fortuitous combination of lack of an established denominational dogma, diversity of background and philosophy, the concept of Christian education, concern for utilitarian training, a shortage of dominating personalities, and variety of faculty members that produced the breadth and the flexibility that are such notable characteristics of Acadia College in the 19th century. And without that breadth and that flexibility, I cannot see how Acadia could have survived the early decades, let alone finish the century as the largest college in the Maritime provinces. Building on such a base, Acadia College proved to be remarkably open to new ideas and directions. There seems to have been little in the field of education that its directors were not prepared at least to consider. Not, of course, that they adopted everything that came along, for financial, religious, or pedagogical considerations might militate against such acceptance. However, the college did prove very open to the winds of change that were blowing through the field of higher education in the 19th century. Perhaps nowhere is this more obvious than in the areas of female education and the struggle between science and religion. When Horton Academy and Acadia College were founded, there was little serious consideration given to the education of females. The Baptists were concerned with establishing institutions to provide the necessary skills and the background for its young men to join the forward march of society. Women, it was supposed, would share in the general benefits that would thus result. In the maritime colonies, as elsewhere, there were very mixed feelings about providing a formal education for females. However, there appear to have been no deeply entrenched, widely held views on the subject, thus opening the door to reevaluation and change. Among maritime Baptists, those of New Brunswick took the lead when they opened their new academy in Fredericton to male and female alike. By the late 1840s, greatly influenced by developments in New England, maritime Baptists openly and extensively examined the issue of female education. In the long debate that ensued, the role played by men prominent in the affairs of Acadia was conspicuous. Differing views were expressed as to why females should be educated, or to what extent, but by the 1850s there appears to have been surprisingly little discussion over whether females should be educated. In the minds of many, the education of females became closely allied with, even a contributing factor to, all the other aspirations and designs of the Baptist body. As one anonymous writer to the press observed in 1849, Unless something more is done properly to educate the female portion of the Baptist population, we shall scarcely hold our ground. Now, until the mothers become better educated, all hope of accomplishing our wishes will prove a failure. Woman's influence is powerful, much more so than we readily perceive. It is exerted so silently that we are not always aware of it. It is in proportion to the cultivation and refinement of nations, and is destined, in my opinion, to sway an untold power at no distant day in renovating this fallen world. And so we must believe that the education of females is not only in itself of overwhelming importance, but the shortest cut to the education of males. Several private schools for young ladies were opened by Baptists in the 1850s, while the next decade saw the beginnings of efforts by the denomination to provide education for their daughters, as well as their sons, at Wolfville. Much of what they desired was summed up in one short phrase in a newspaper report: female education, thorough, efficient, and cheap. Establishing a female seminary was one thing. Admitting women to the full college course was obviously something quite different. And yet, for the Baptists of the Maritime Provinces, it does not seem to have been a giant intellectual step. Having challenged prevailing concepts of education for the lower classes, questioning restricted access to education on the basis of sex perhaps came relatively easily. By mid-century, few Baptists seemed willing openly to doubt the wisdom of providing as much education for a female as she was capable of handling. How this would be paid for, either by the individual family or by the denomination, and how such financial demands ranked in relation to the needs for male education seem to have been the overriding considerations, rather than the pedagogical or philosophical concerns that seem to so preoccupy certain other North American bodies and institutions. As early as 1852, one writer to the Christian Messenger, after outlining what benefits to family, church, and society would be derived from female education, went on to state, "I must mention also the claims of females to a higher education solely on their own account, the increase of happiness from more of thought and knowledge, the highest sources of pleasure. Intellectual cultivation is indeed the birthright of woman as a human being, and when this right is yielded, the effects are at once visible in the greater activity and usefulness of females, in the increased happiness and altered tone of society, in the intelligent looks which meet the public speaker from his audience, in the more refined atmosphere of domestic life, and in the more rapid progress of mankind in all that is great and good." A few years later, one father, writing to the press, demolished the underpinnings of those opponents of higher education for females by holding their views up to ridicule. And in the process, he asked that all-important question, why not? He argued, of course let the girls go to college. Yes, educate the girls. Let them know how to knit and sew, how to make puddings, make the bread, the butter and the cheese, to sweep the floor, dust the chairs, darn the stockings, make the bed, and rock the cradle. But imagine not that these are the highest and holiest employments for which they are capable. Give them books. Put the pen into their hand. Let them look through the telescope into the heavens. Teach them botany, geology, chemistry, logic, language. Let them read Cicero, Virgil, Homer, Xenophon. Teach them Hebrew. Teach them everything man needs to know. Let them attend the same classes with males? Why not? Do we live in Syria, in Turkey, in Hindustan? That our customs and laws require the entire separation of the sexes while they are growing up? No, we live in Nova Scotia, in North America, where time out of mind the boys and girls have been sent to school together, have sat upon the same benches, studied and read out of the same books, recited in the same class, and walked home in company. I never heard the practice denounced as either sin or shame. Oh, you say, but they would be thinking about one another, talking to one another, falling in love with one another, writing love letters, courting, and all of that, sure as rates, if they saw each other in school. Would they indeed? What a phenomenon. Only think of it. Boys and girls, young men and young women, actually thinking about each other, becoming fond of each other's company. And, mysterious, amazing, unheard of event, actually thinking of matrimony. And all this is a result of sending them to learn Greek, Latin, French, and trigonometry together. Prevent the operation of nature's laws, will you? Hinder the young people from falling in love? Ha! Not by sending them to different schools will you do it, I guess. And not by keeping them at home. When you can make a law and enforce it, that the tide in the Bay of Fundy shall not ebb and flow, when you can command as Joshua did, "Sun, stand thou still upon Mount Gibeon," then, not before, can you suppress these emotions implanted in mortal bosoms by God himself for the noblest and most benevolent of purposes. Out upon such nonsense. It might be ridiculous nonsense to this common sense, I rather suspect, rural writer, and to many others in the colony at the time. But these ridiculed ideas would be taken very seriously indeed by many educators in North America and Europe for much of the rest of the century. Those who guided Acadia through these perilous waters seemed to share such common sense views about higher education for females. Certainly Crawley and Sawyer, at least, among the presidents, were in favor of opening wide the doors of the college. As early as 1874, President Sawyer had recommended such a step to the Board of Governors. Financial considerations would delay the beginning of female education at Acadia until 1880, but when it came, it caused scarcely a ripple. It did not even require a special resolution of the Board of Governors. It was merely done. The following year, the Board informed the Convention of the action taken, observing that, quote, "Thus the privileges of the college will henceforth be open to the sons and daughters of the land and on the same conditions," unquote. Parenthetically, it should be noted that it was obviously not considered necessary to seek Convention's approval, even for such a major departure from past practice. A year later, the board reported to Convention rather laconically, "As yet there are no indications that a mistake was made in admitting young women to the privileges of the college." And that was that. In 1884, Acadia awarded its first degree to a female graduate, the second institution in the British Empire to take such a step. The willingness of Acadia College and many maritime Baptists to extend their vision of education to include the female portion of the population, although not always on equal terms, I should say, is, I would suggest, further evidence of a broadly based, flexible approach to education, one that had not yet hardened into rigidity. Such could not be said of every college in Canada in the 19th century. Another example among many of the way in which such flexibility shaped the contours of the college and greatly strengthened what the institution stood for can be seen in Acadia's response to the growing tension between science and religion in the latter half of the 19th century. The scientific discoveries of the age and the theories that they spawned had much of the Christian church in turmoil. The age of Darwin had dawned. If the churches of Christendom had difficulty dealing with the issues raised, so did the colleges. How could one pursue knowledge and truth in the laboratory and the classroom if it led one to question the divinely revealed truths found in the Scriptures? Yet not to pursue knowledge as far as one could go seemed to be the abandonment of all that a college had traditionally stood for. But would not and did not rational inquiry lead to skepticism? North American and British academics and theologians strove to grapple with these perplexing problems in the years following the publication of Darwin's On the Origins of Species in 1859. The academics and theologians at Acadia were no exception. One might have expected to find among maritime Baptists outright condemnation and then dismissal of Darwin and of the new scientific knowledge and theories. Instead, one finds a calm, temperate debate from which hysterical overreaction seems largely absent. Those maritime Baptists who wrote and spoke in the debate between science and religion expressed, as one would expect, a variety of views. As with so many other issues during this period of time, there seems to have been no orthodox Baptist position to defend, no generally agreed upon stand to take. The response, then, was not to recoil in horror, but to examine and debate, in a way not always possible, perhaps, in some other denominations and institutions in Canada. Throughout the 1840s and 50s at Acadia, before Darwin, scientific exploration was often lauded as part of the means by which mankind would advance. The enthusiasm for science of Isaac Chipman and his stature within the denomination and the college certainly made science a respected, even essential part of the college curriculum. Many welcomed the new methods since, as one writer observed, united with the most powerful energies of Christianity, science has raised the human mind from a fearful depth of degradation, and we foresee that day is near when by their cooperation, united with art, the intellectual and moral powers of man shall be mightily enlarged and purified. J.M. Cramp, while primarily a theologian and church historian, was fascinated with scientific discovery and speculation. For example, in the mid-1850s, he gave a talk both in Halifax and here in Wolfville that explored the possibility of life on other planets. Although he concluded that it was impossible to ascertain for certain, he argued that it was highly likely that such life did exist. Such a view, with its obvious theological implications, elicited no anguished cry of outrage. In fact, there is no evidence of any response at all. Science fascinated, perplexed, and mystified, but it does not seem to have frightened. The upheaval following the publication of Darwin's ideas does not seem to have shaken Cramp's faith in the importance of scientific exploration and discovery. As he told Acadia's graduating class of 1867, apart from the gratification which such studies afford and their bearing on intellectual progress, the connection of science with religion is so intimate and important that every true friend of the one should seek to be well acquainted with the other. So far from being antagonistic, as is frequently affirmed, they contribute mutual illustration and help. Nothing less could be expected. The works and the word of God must be in full harmony. God cannot contradict in one book what he has written in another. Reason and faith are twin sisters. Faith is vindicated by reason, and reason is dignified by faith. The discoveries and researches of modern times have shed a flood of light on the divine record and removed numerous obscurities which have long seemed impenetrable. We rejoice in the labors of the genuine philosopher and welcome him as an ally in the warfare against evil. Let us be willing, too, to receive his instruction and follow him when he leads us into the deep things of God, the wonders and intricacies of material laws. We have no reason to fear the results. And at any rate, if we admit scientific enlightenment, we shall not be deceived by plausible but crude theories or carried away by hasty generalizations. But there may be much danger if we are willingly ignorant in these matters, since we may become an easy prey to cunning and malicious unbelievers. Long before the beginning of the reconciliation of science and religion is claimed to have taken place in Acadia, in Canada, it has already begun at Acadia College under a faculty and a denomination that is still broadly enough based to absorb even the shocks of Darwinism, and moreover to see something very positive in the whole confrontation. That such views were not merely the private musings of a few Baptist intellectuals and faculty members is made very clear when one examines some of the student essays and orations of the period. In his graduating essay in 1870, one student, perhaps slightly carried away by his topic, argued that everywhere positivism and New Testament Christianity